Take her out of my lobby. Now. The words cracked through the polished air like a glass dropped on marble, sharp enough to turn heads without raising his voice. And in an instant the entire room shifted, conversations thinning into silence, heels pausing mid-step. The soft hum of the chandelier is suddenly louder than it should have been. Ethan Cole didn't repeat himself. He didn't need to. Not in a place where everything, from the temperature set to a precise 72 degrees to the scent of citrus and linen threaded through. The ventilation moved according to his will, and yet something about the small figure near the front desk refused to move with the rest of the room. A child, maybe 5 or 6, standing beside a housekeeping cart that still smelled faintly of bleach and warm cotton, her sneakers damp from the rain outside, leaving faint, uneven prints across the glossy floor, as if she hadn't yet learned that this kind of space wasn't meant to hold footprints at all. Lena Brooks stood just behind her, shoulders tight beneath a standard-issue uniform that had been washed too many times, her name tag slightly crooked, her fingers still curled around a microfiber cloth as though she hadn't decided whether to keep cleaning or to shield her daughter from the eyes now gathering around them. And there were many guests, staff, a manager hovering near the concierge desk pretending to check something on a tablet, while clearly waiting for direction. Waiting for Ethan, because everything here waited for him. He stepped forward, measured, composed, the soft tap of his leather shoes echoing just enough to remind everyone who set the rhythm in this place. His gaze flicking once to Lena, dismissing her almost instantly as part of the background, he paid to remain invisible, then settling on the girl. And that's when it happened. Not a dramatic shift, not a gasp, or a stumble. Just a fraction of a second where his breath didn't land the way it should have, because the girl wasn't looking down like most people did when he spoke. She was looking straight at him, steady, unafraid, her eyes reflecting the chandelier light in a way that felt oddly familiar. Too familiar, like seeing something he had forgotten to remember. "This isn't a daycare," he said, quieter now but colder, the kind of tone that made people correct themselves before they even knew what they'd done wrong. And Lena's lips parted slightly as if to apologize, to explain, to shrink the moment back into something manageable. But the girl didn't step back, didn't hide behind her mother. Instead she shifted her weight, one small hand brushing against the metal handle of the cart, the faint squeak of its wheel cutting through the silence in a way that felt louder than it was. And then she did something no one expected. She took a step forward, just one, her damp sneaker, pressing into the polished floor, and said, "Wait," not loud, not defiant, just clear enough that it landed exactly where it needed to. And for a brief second the entire lobby seemed to hold its breath again, not because of the word itself, but because of how it was said, calm, certain, like she believed she had the right to be heard. Ethan's jaw tightened, the instinct to shut it down immediate, efficient, practiced, because control was something he never let slip, not in front of staff, not in front of guests, not in front of anyone. And yet his eyes stayed on her longer than necessary, tracing something he couldn't quite name. The curve of her cheek, the shape of her brow, details that should have meant nothing and yet refused to pass unnoticed. And somewhere behind him a guest cleared their throat, the faint clink of a glass at the bar breaking the stillness just enough to remind the room it was still moving, still alive, still watching. "Security," Ethan said finally, his voice. He did not move, even as the head of security stepped forward from the side of the lobby, posture straight, expression already set into that practiced neutrality reserved for uncomfortable situations, waiting for the smallest signal to act. Lena felt it before it happened, the shift, the tightening of space around her, and she lowered her voice quickly, almost instinctively. "Amara, honey, come here." Her hand reaching gently toward the girl's shoulder, not pulling, just guiding, as if she knew that any sudden movement would make things worse. But Amara did not step back right away, her eyes still fixed on Ethan, studying him with a kind of quiet attention that did not belong to a child in a room like this. And it unsettled him more than raised voices ever could. "Sir," the security officer said softly, just enough to remind him that the room was still waiting, that decisions did not pause for feelings. And Ethan exhaled slowly, the kind of controlled breath that usually reset everything into place. "Handle it," he replied, turning slightly as if to move on, as if the moment had already been resolved in his mind. but his gaze flickered back again, uninvited, catching the way the girl's small hand slipped into her mother's, the contrast of their skin against the polished chrome of the card handle, and something about that image held longer than it should have, like a reflection he could not quite look away from. Lena nodded quickly, her voice low and careful. "We are leaving. I am so sorry." The words coming out with that familiar softness of someone who had learned that apology often came before explanation, and she began to guide Amara toward the service hallway, away from the front desk, away from the eyes, away from him. But as they turned, one of the guests near the entrance dropped a set of keys, the metallic clatter echoing sharply across the marble floor. And instinctively Amara bent down, quicker than anyone else, picking them up with both hands, holding them carefully like something important, her fingers brushing against the engraved leather tag before she looked up and stepped toward Ethan again, closing a distance no one had given her permission to cross. The security officer hesitated, just for a fraction of a second, unsure whether to intercept, because the movement was not aggressive, not disruptive, just direct. And Ethan felt it again. That brief, unfamiliar pause in his otherwise precise timing, as the girl extended her hand. "You dropped this," she said, her voice steady, the kind of steadiness that did not match her size. And when he reached out to take the keys, their fingers did not quite touch, but they came close enough for him to notice the detail he had not seen before, a small, faint birthmark near her wrist, barely visible under the lobby lights, shaped like a soft curve, something oddly specific, something that stirred a memory he could not immediately place, and he pulled his hand back a fraction too quickly, as if the recognition had brushed against him without permission. "Thank you," he said, the words automatic, but his tone quieter now, less like a command and more like something uncertain, and Amara gave a small nod, not smiling, not seeking approval, just acknowledging the exchange as if it mattered. Then she turned back toward her mother, slipping her hand into Lena's. Again, and this time they moved toward the service corridor without stopping, the wheels of the housekeeping cart squeaking softly as they disappeared past the staff-only doors. The lobby exhaled around them, conversations returning in cautious fragments, heels resuming their rhythm, the hum of the chandelier settling back into the background, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer than necessary, the keys still in his hand, the leather tag pressing lightly against his palm, and for reasons he could not explain, he flipped it over, reading the engraved name he had seen 1,000 times before. Cole. Clean and familiar. And yet the way the girl had held it, the way she had looked at him, made it feel different, as if the name belonged to more than just him, as if it echoed somewhere beyond the walls of the hotel. "Sir," the manager's voice came from behind him, careful, measured. "Should I file an incident report?" And Ethan did not answer right away, his eyes drifting briefly toward the closed service doors, the faint outline of movement already gone, replaced by polished stillness. And when he finally spoke, his voice was even again, controlled. "No," he said, turning away at last. "It is handled." But as he walked across the lobby, the reflection beneath his feet showed something slightly out of sync, not in his steps, but in his focus, because for the first time in a long while, Ethan Cole was not entirely certain that he had seen everything he was supposed to see. The service hallway swallowed the noise of the lobby the moment the door closed behind them, the air shifting from polished citrus to something sharper, cleaner, the scent of disinfectant lingering in a way that felt more honest, and Lena finally exhaled, not loudly, just enough to release the tension she had been holding in her shoulders since the moment Ethan Cole's voice cut across the room. The wheels of the cart rolled softer here, their faint squeak echoing against the narrow walls lined with supply shelves and neatly stacked towels, and Amara walked beside her quietly, her small hand still wrapped around Lena's fingers, but her gaze was distant now, as if she was replaying something in her mind that had not quite settled. "You cannot do that," Lena said gently after a few steps, her voice low, careful, not scolding but firm in the way only a mother could be. "You cannot just walk up to people like that. Especially here." And Amara looked up at her, blinking once, the overhead fluorescent lights reflecting in her eyes. "But he dropped it," she said simply, as if that explained everything, and Lena's lips pressed together for a moment, caught between correction and understanding, because the truth was, It did explain everything to a child who had not yet learned how complicated adults could make simple things. I know, Lena replied softly, adjusting her grip on the cart handle. You did the right thing, but sometimes doing the right thing still causes trouble. And the words hung there, heavier than they should have been, settling into the quiet space between them. They turned a corner, passing a row of closed doors marked staff only, the distant hum of laundry machines vibrating faintly through the floor, and for a moment it felt like the world outside that hallway did not exist at all, like the marble floors and chandelier light belonged to a different reality entirely. Amara slowed slightly, her sneakers making soft, damp sounds against the industrial tile, and then she asked, "Why did he look at me like that?" The question came out without hesitation, but there was something underneath it, something searching, and Lena's steps faltered just enough to notice, her heart tightening in a way she did not show, because she had seen that look too. The brief pause, the flicker of something she had hoped would never surface again. People look at things they do not expect, Lena said after a moment, choosing her words carefully, keeping her tone steady. And sometimes they do not know what to do with what they see. Amara considered that, her brow furrowing slightly. He did not look confused. She said, quieter now. He looked like he forgot something. And Lena stopped walking altogether this time, the cart rolling forward an inch before settling, her hand tightening slightly around the handle as those words landed deeper than she wanted them to. For a second, she closed her eyes, not long enough for anyone else to notice, just long enough to steady herself, because memory was a dangerous thing when it arrived uninvited, especially in places where the past had no business returning. Come on, she said gently, her voice softer now, guiding Amara forward again. We still have rooms to finish, and they continued down the hallway, but the rhythm had changed, slower, heavier, as if each step carried more than just the weight of the day. Back in the lobby, Ethan stood near the front desk, though he had no reason to be there anymore, his schedule already waiting on his phone, meetings lined up with the kind of precision he prided himself on. And yet his thumb hovered over the screen without tapping anything, his mind replaying the moment in fragments, the way the girl had said wait, the way she had held the keys, the faint curve of that birthmark near her wrist, and something about it refused to align with the neat compartments he usually kept his thoughts in. Sir, your 10 o'clock is ready, the concierge said politely, pulling him back into the present, and Ethan nodded once, slipping the phone into his pocket. But as he turned to walk toward the elevators, his reflection followed him across the polished floor. Steady, composed, unchanged on the surface. And yet there was a subtle delay in his focus, a lingering awareness that something had shifted just out of reach. The elevator doors opened with a soft chime, and he stepped inside, the mirrored walls surrounding him instantly multiplying his image into clean, identical angles, each one controlled, each one certain. And yet none of them answered the question forming quietly beneath his thoughts, a question he had not asked in years, not since he had learned how to move forward without looking back. And as the doors closed, sealing him off from the lobby below, the last thing he saw before the reflection disappeared was not his own face, but the echo of a pair of eyes that had looked at him like he was supposed to remember something he had already left behind. The elevator rose in silence, smooth and controlled, the kind of movement that never called attention to itself, and Ethan Cole stood still inside it, hands relaxed at his sides, posture unchanged, yet his mind refused to follow the same steady path, instead circling back to something small, something he could not justify spending time on, and yet could not let go of. The number display above the doors ticked upward, 10, 11, 12, each soft chime marking progress he usually appreciated. But today the sound felt distant, like it belonged to someone else's routine, and in the mirrored walls his reflection stood tall, composed, perfectly aligned with the image he had built over years of discipline and control. But behind that image there was a subtle disruption, a detail out of place, like a perfectly tailored suit with a single thread pulled loose. When the doors opened onto the executive floor, the air shifted again, quieter, cooler, insulated from the rhythm below, and his assistant, Claire, was already waiting near his office door, tablet in hand, her expression attentive, efficient, exactly as expected. Good morning, Mr. Cole, Your 10 o'clock is in the conference room, and legal sent over the revised draft for your review, she said, falling into step beside him as he walked down the hallway lined with dark wood panels and framed cityscapes. Each detail curated, intentional, controlled, just like everything else in his world. Reschedule the 10 o'clock. Ethan said without slowing, his voice even. But the request was unusual enough that Claire glanced up briefly, not questioning, just noting. Of course, would you like me to move it to this afternoon? No, he replied, reaching his office door. Next week. And that pause, that shift, was enough to register, because Ethan Cole did not delay meetings without reason, and yet he offered none, simply stepping inside his office where the floor-to-ceiling windows overlooked the city, the skyline stretching out in clean lines and distant motion. Claire hesitated for half a second before nodding. Understood. And the door closed softly behind him, sealing the room into a quiet that was almost absolute, broken only by the faint hum of the climate control and the distant echo of traffic far below. Ethan walked to his desk, but did not sit immediately, his hand resting lightly on the edge of the polished surface, eyes drifting to the reflection in the glass. The city mirrored faintly beneath his own image, and for a moment he allowed himself to stand there without doing anything, without reaching for a file, without checking his phone, just standing, because the question that had followed him up the elevator was no longer quiet. It was present now, clear enough to acknowledge even if he did not yet understand it. He turned, moving toward the side cabinet where a small drawer held items he rarely thought about, things that had no place in his current life but had never been discarded either. And he opened it slowly, the soft slide of wood against wood louder in the stillness than it should have been, revealing a few neatly arranged objects, a watch he no longer wore, a set of old keys, and beneath them, a photograph, slightly worn at the edges, the colors faded just enough to place it firmly in the past. He picked it up without hesitation, his fingers steady, but his breath shifting almost imperceptibly as he looked at it. A younger version of himself standing beside a woman whose smile carried a warmth that did not exist in his life anymore. Her skin deep brown against the soft sunlight in the image, her hand resting lightly at her side. And for a moment the memory came back not as a story, but as a feeling, something unstructured, unfinished, something he had chosen not to follow to its conclusion. Lena, he said quietly, not as a question, but as recognition, the name, settling into the room with a weight that made the silence heavier. And then his gaze shifted to the lower corner of the photograph, where a small detail caught his attention, something he had never noticed before or had chosen to ignore, the faint outline of a hospital bracelet on her wrist, partially hidden but still visible, and next to it, a date, one that aligned too closely with the time he had long ago categorized as resolved, closed, finished. His jaw tightened slightly, not in anger, but in realization, the kind that does not arrive all at once but builds in quiet layers, each piece connecting to something he had dismissed before, the timeline, the look in the girl's eyes, the birthmark, the way she had said wait, not like a child asking permission, but like someone who already belonged in the conversation. He set the photograph down slowly, his movements controlled, deliberate, but there was a shift now, something beneath the surface that no longer aligned with the certainty he carried into every room, and he turned back toward the window, the city still moving below, unchanged, indifferent, while inside that office, something had begun to move in the opposite direction, backward, toward a past he had not planned to revisit, and for the first time in a long time, Ethan Cole was not thinking about what came next, but about something he might have left unfinished, something that was no longer content to remain in the past. The photograph did not move, but everything around it felt slightly less stable, as if the weight of what it contained had shifted the balance of the room, and Ethan Cole stood there longer than he intended, the skyline still stretching beyond the glass, while his focus remained fixed on something far smaller, far older, something he had once convinced himself no longer mattered. His fingers hovered just above the edge of the image before he finally picked it up again, slower this time, as though the act itself required a decision he had not yet fully made. And when he looked at Lena's face in that captured moment, the warmth in her expression contrasted sharply with the controlled, distant environment he now stood in. The kind of warmth that did not fit into boardrooms or contracts or carefully scheduled meetings, the kind that had once existed outside of everything he built his life around. He turned the photograph slightly, catching the light differently, and that small motion revealed more than he expected. The faint crease near the corner, the kind that only forms when something has been folded, carried, handled more than it should have been, and he realized, not suddenly but steadily, that this was not a memory he had forgotten. It was one he had chosen to store away without resolution. His jaw tightened again, not with resistance this time, but with recognition, because the timeline no longer felt abstract. It felt specific, measurable, like the dates on a contract he could not ignore, and without thinking further, he set the photograph down with care, reached for his phone, and tapped once, precise, deliberate. "Claire," he said when she answered, his voice returning to its usual calm, but carrying a different intention beneath it. "I need the full employee file for Lena Brooks, housekeeping, active staff." There was a brief pause on the other end, not hesitation, just processing. "Yes, sir, I will have it sent to you shortly," she replied, professional as always, and the line ended without further question, because questions were not part of how his office operated. Ethan placed the phone down and stepped back toward the window, his reflection once again aligning with the city beyond. But now there was movement behind his eyes, calculation, not of numbers or deals, but of possibilities he had not previously considered. And for the first time, the memory of that day in the lobby did not feel like an interruption. It felt like a point of entry, a moment that connected two timelines he had kept separate. A soft knock broke the silence, and before he could respond, the door opened slightly, Claire stepping in with a tablet. Held close, her expression composed but attentive. "Here is the file, sir," she said, placing it gently on the desk, and Ethan turned immediately, crossing the room with measured steps, his focus narrowing as he reached for it. The digital document illuminating the screen with clean, organized data, the kind he trusted, the kind that did not leave room for interpretation. He scrolled once, then again, his eyes scanning quickly, efficiently, past employment history, certifications, references, until he reached the section that mattered more than the rest. And there it was, listed plainly, without emphasis, without context, just a line among many. Dependent, Amara Brooks, age 6, and for a brief moment, the room seemed to narrow, the quiet tightening around him as the information settled into place. He did not react outwardly, did not pause long enough for anyone else to notice. But internally the alignment continued. The details connecting with a precision he could not dismiss, the age, the timeline, the memory of Lena, the look in the girl's eyes, and then his gaze shifted again, lower, to another line, one that should have been routine, insignificant, but now carried weight. Emergency contact, none listed. And something in that absence struck him differently than the presence of everything else, because it suggested something unfinished, something unacknowledged, something that had never been properly recorded. "Leave it," he said quietly, though Claire had not reached to take the tablet back, and she nodded once, stepping away without interrupting the moment, the door closing softly behind her once more. Ethan remained standing, the file still open in his hand, the glow of the screen reflecting faintly against his face, and for the first time, the certainty he had relied on for years was no longer absolute. It had shifted into something else, something more deliberate, more personal, and as he looked back down at the name Amara Brooks, the echo of that single word from the lobby returned, not loud, not demanding, but clear enough that it no longer felt like coincidence. It felt like a question he could no longer choose to ignore. The name stayed on the screen longer than it should have, not because Ethan Cole needed more time to read it, but because something in him resisted the finality of what it implied, as if looking away too quickly would allow him to dismiss it as coincidence. And yet he did not look away, his eyes tracing the line again. Amara Brooks, age 6. The number settling into his mind with a precision that mirrored the exactness he applied to every deal, every decision, every risk he had ever calculated. Except this one did not behave like a calculation. It did not offer a clean outcome or a clear next step. He set the tablet down slowly on the desk, the soft tap of it against the polished surface louder in the quiet than expected, and for a moment he simply stood there, hands resting lightly at his sides, the city beyond the glass continuing its steady movement while inside the room everything felt suspended, as if time itself had chosen to wait for him to decide what this meant. A faint memory surfaced again, not in full detail, but in fragments. Lena standing in sunlight, her voice calm, her presence grounded in a way that contrasted sharply with the structured life he had built afterward. And he remembered the conversation they never finished, the one he had walked away from because it did not fit into the future he had already planned, a future that required clarity, control, and no complications. And now, years later, the consequence of that unfinished moment stood quietly in the form of a child who had looked at him like he was supposed to know, something he had never allowed himself to confirm. The office door opened softly behind him, and Claire stepped in again, her movements measured, respectful of the silence she could sense without needing explanation. "Sir, housekeeping is scheduled on the 20th floor this afternoon, including Ms. Brooks' rotation," she said, not offering the information as anything more than part of his daily operations. But the timing of it landed differently now, no longer routine, no longer insignificant. Ethan did not turn immediately, his gaze still directed toward the window, but his voice came after a brief pause, steady but carrying a new weight. "Adjust the schedule," he said. "Move her rotation to this floor." And Claire hesitated for just a fraction of a second, not because the request was impossible, but because it was unusual, a deviation from the system he had built so carefully. "Yes, sir," she replied, already making the note. "This afternoon?" "No," he said, finally turning to face her, his expression composed, but his eyes more focused than before. "Now." And that single word shifted the air in the room, not dramatically, but enough to signal that this was no longer a routine adjustment. Claire nodded without further question and stepped back, the door closing behind her once more, leaving Ethan alone again. But this time the silence felt different, not heavy with uncertainty, but sharpened with intention. He walked back to the desk and picked up the photograph again, holding it at eye level, comparing the memory it held with the image forming in his mind from earlier that day. The shape of a face, the steadiness of a gaze, the small, unspoken confidence in the way the girl had stood her ground, and the alignment was no longer abstract. It was forming into something real, something that required more than observation. Minutes passed, though they did not feel like minutes, the quiet stretching until a soft knock sounded again, followed by the faint squeak of wheels in the hallway just outside, and Ethan felt it before he saw it. The subtle shift in the space beyond the door, the presence of something that did not belong to his usual environment. "Come in," he said, his voice even, controlled, but there was an undercurrent now, something quieter, something almost cautious. And when the door opened, Lena stepped inside first, her posture straight but guarded, her hands resting lightly on the handle of the housekeeping cart as if it offered some kind of boundary. And beside her, just slightly behind, Amara stood, her small frame still, her eyes already lifting to meet his, not hesitant, not searching, just present. The room seemed to contract slightly, the distance between them closing in a way that had nothing to do with physical space. And for a brief moment, no one spoke. Not because there was nothing to say, but because the words had not yet arranged themselves into something either of them was ready to release. And Ethan Cole, a man who had built his entire life on knowing exactly what to say and when to say it, found himself standing in a silence that did not respond to control, a silence that waited, patiently, for something more honest than he had given in a very long time. No one moved at first. Not even the air seemed willing to shift, as if the room itself understood that whatever happened next would not fit neatly into the structure Ethan Cole had built around his life. And he stood there, facing them, the distance between his desk and the doorway suddenly feeling shorter than it should have been, his eyes settling on Lena first, taking in the familiar lines of her face, older now, more guarded, shaped by years he had not witnessed. And then his gaze moved, almost involuntarily, to Amara, who did not look away, who did not shrink under the weight of the room or the man standing in it, but simply stood, steady, present, as if she had already decided that this moment mattered. "You asked for me, sir," Lena said quietly, her voice controlled, respectful, but there was a tension beneath it, something held tight. something that had learned not to expect fairness from rooms like this. And Ethan nodded once, though the motion felt delayed, like his body was catching up to a thought he had not fully formed yet. Yes, he said, his voice even, but softer than it had been in the lobby. I did. And then the silence returned, not empty, but filled with everything that had not yet been said. Amara shifted slightly beside her mother, her hand brushing against the edge of the cart, the faint metal click echoing in the quiet. And then she took a small step forward, not enough to break the space completely, but enough to change it, and Ethan felt it again, that subtle disruption, that sense that control was no longer entirely his to dictate. You work here, he said finally, directing the statement toward Lena, though his eyes flickered back to the child almost immediately, as if the confirmation itself was less important than the presence beside her, and Lena nodded. Yes, sir, housekeeping, she replied, her posture straight, her tone professional, the kind of response she had given countless times before. But this time it carried something else, a quiet awareness that this conversation was not about her job. Ethan took a slow breath, his gaze lowering briefly to the photograph still resting on his desk, then lifting again, connecting the past to the present in a way that no longer allowed distance. And your daughter, he said, the words measured, careful. She is here with you today? It was not a question, but Lena answered it anyway. Yes, sir. I had no one to watch her. Her voice steady, not apologizing this time, just stating a fact, and something in that difference did not go unnoticed. Amara looked between them, her brow furrowing slightly, sensing the shift without understanding the details, and then her eyes returned to Ethan, holding his gaze with that same quiet certainty, and he felt it again, sharper now. The recognition that had begun as a flicker in the lobby and had now grown into something undeniable, something that pressed against the edges of everything he thought he knew. What is your name? He asked, though he already knew, the question serving less as a request for information and more as a bridge he was trying to cross. And the girl answered without hesitation. Amara, she said, her voice clear, and then after a brief pause, as if adding something that mattered, Amara Brooks, and the name landed fully this time, no longer just a line on a file, no longer just a connection he was piecing together, but something spoken, something real, something standing in front of him. Ethan nodded slowly, his mind aligning details with a precision he could no longer ignore, and then he asked the question that had been forming since the moment she said wait in the lobby. How old are you, Amara? His tone calm, but there was something beneath it now, something almost careful, and she answered just as simply, 6, and that number settled into the room like a final piece placed exactly where it belonged. The timeline no longer abstract, no longer flexible, but fixed. Lena's hand tightened slightly on the cart handle, her knuckles whitening just enough to show the pressure she was holding back, and for the first time since she stepped into the office, she spoke without waiting for his lead. Sir, if this is about earlier, I can assure you it will not happen again. Her voice still respectful, but now edged with something firmer, something protective, and Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, seeing not just the employee standing in front of him, but the woman from the photograph, the one he had left behind without finishing the conversation that now stood in front of him in a different form. He opened his mouth to respond, but the words did not come immediately, because for once, the response he needed was not procedural, not rehearsed, not something he could deliver without consequence. And in that pause, in that rare break in his control, Amara spoke again, her voice softer this time, but carrying further than anything else in the room. You look like me, she said, not accusing, not questioning, just stating what she saw, and the simplicity of it cut through everything else, leaving no space for deflection, no space for denial, only a truth that had been quietly building since the moment he first saw her, standing in his lobby. The words did not echo, but they stayed, settling into the room with a quiet weight that no one could move around, and Ethan Cole felt something shift in a place he had not allowed anything to reach in years, not a visible reaction, not something anyone else could point to, but a pause that lasted just long enough to break the rhythm he had built his life on. He looked at Amaro again, not as a passing observation this time, not as a detail to be dismissed, but as something that required attention, something that asked for recognition, And in that moment the resemblance was no longer subtle. It was structured, the alignment of features too precise to ignore, the shape of her eyes, the angle of her brow, the quiet steadiness in the way she held his gaze, and it was not just what she looked like, it was how she looked at him, as if she expected something from him that he had not yet given. Lena's grip on the cart tightened further, the faint creak of metal under her fingers breaking the silence for just a second, and she stepped forward slightly, placing herself just enough between Ethan and her daughter to create a boundary that did not need to be spoken. "Amara," she said softly, her voice carrying both warning and care. "That is enough." But Amara did not step back immediately, her eyes still on Ethan, as if she was waiting for him to respond to what she had said, not because she needed confirmation, but because she believed he understood. Ethan inhaled slowly, the breath controlled but heavier than usual, and when he spoke, his voice was quieter, stripped of the sharp edge it carried in the lobby. "Children see patterns," he said, the words measured, careful, as if he was constructing them while speaking. "They notice similarities." And it sounded logical, reasonable, something that fit within the structure of explanation he was used to relying on. But even as he said it, the statement felt incomplete, like it only covered part of what was happening in the room. Amara tilted her head slightly, considering his words, her expression thoughtful rather than confused. "It is not just that," she said after a moment, her voice still calm, still steady. "It feels the same." And that sentence did not fit into any structure Ethan had prepared. It did not align with logic or data or anything he could quantify. And for the first time since they entered the office, he did not have an immediate response. Lena exhaled softly, a breath she had been holding since the moment her daughter spoke, and she stepped forward more firmly now, placing a gentle hand on Amara's shoulder. "We should get back to work," she said, her tone polite but decisive, her eyes briefly meeting Ethan's before looking away, not out of submission, but out of control, as if she was choosing to end the moment before it went somewhere neither of them was ready to face. Ethan watched her, the movement, the restraint, the decision, and he recognized it for what it was, not avoidance, but protection, and something about that made the silence heavier, because it meant this was not new to her. This was something she had already considered, something she had already chosen how to handle. "Wait," he said, the word leaving his mouth before he had fully decided to say it, and the shift was immediate. Lena stopped, her hand still resting on Amara's shoulder, her posture tightening just slightly, while Amara looked back at him without hesitation, as if she had been expecting that word all along. Ethan took a step forward, closing a distance he had maintained since they entered, his movements slower now, more deliberate, and when he spoke again, his voice carried something different. Not authority, not distance, but something closer to uncertainty. "Lena," he said, using her name for the first time in the present, not just in memory, and that alone changed the space between them. "How long have you been working here?" It was not the question that mattered, but the way he asked it, not as an employer reviewing a file, but as someone trying to place a timeline that extended beyond employment records. Lena hesitated, just briefly, her eyes searching his face for something she could not quite define, and then she answered. "Almost a year," her voice steady, but there was something guarded beneath it, something that had learned not to assume intention. Ethan nodded once, the information aligning with what he already knew, and then his gaze shifted again, back to Amara, the question forming clearly now, no longer something he could avoid, no longer something he could explain away, and though he did not say it yet, it was there, present, waiting, the same way the silence had waited earlier, and this time, it was not going to pass without an answer. The question formed fully now, no longer something Ethan Cole could hold at the edge of his thoughts, no longer something that could be softened by distance or delayed by control, and it pressed forward with a clarity that matched the precision he had always relied on. Except this time the outcome was not something he could predict. He took another step closer, not enough to crowd the space, but enough that the separation between them felt intentional rather than fixed, and when he spoke, his voice was lower, steadier, but carrying a weight that had not been there before. "When did you find out?" he said, his eyes on Lena, not Amara, because this was not a question a child could answer, not fully, not in the way he needed it answered, and the room seemed to narrow again. the air tightening around the words as they settled. Lena did not respond immediately, her gaze holding his for a moment longer than it had before, searching, measuring, as if she was deciding not just what to say, but whether to say anything at all. And Amara looked between them, her small hand still resting against the cart, sensing the shift without understanding the full shape of it, but knowing that something important was happening. Find out what? Lena said finally, her voice calm. But there was a firmness now, something that did not bend easily, and Ethan exhaled slowly, the control still present, but thinner now, less absolute. Do not do that, he replied, not sharply, but directly. You know what I am asking. And the clarity in his tone left little room for avoidance. But Lena did not step back, did not lower her gaze. Instead, she straightened slightly, her shoulders settling into a position that was no longer just professional, but personal. I know what you think you are asking, she said, her words measured, careful. But that does not mean I owe you an answer. And the statement landed with a quiet force, not raised, not confrontational, but firm enough to hold its ground. And for the first time since they entered the office, Ethan felt something shift in a direction he did not control. Not resistance, but boundary. The silence that followed was different now, not uncertain, but defined, as if the space itself had drawn a line neither of them could ignore. And Amara's eyes moved again, watching, absorbing, her expression thoughtful, and then she spoke, not to interrupt, but because the moment made sense to her in a way that did not require the same complexity. Mom, she said softly. It is okay. And Lena's hand tightened slightly on her shoulder, the protective instinct immediate. It is not about okay, she replied quietly, though her voice softened just a fraction, and Ethan watched that exchange, the ease, the connection, the way the child trusted her without question, and something about it pressed deeper into the space he had not allowed himself to revisit. 6 years, he said. Then, not asking, but stating, the number drawn from the file, from the timeline, from the pieces that had already aligned. She is 6 years old. And Lena's gaze shifted, not away, but inward, as if the words had landed somewhere she could not easily deflect, and for a brief moment, the control she had held so carefully showed a fracture, not visible to anyone who was not looking closely, but enough for Ethan to see it. Yes, she said finally, her voice quieter now, not weaker, but heavier. She is, and the confirmation did not resolve anything. It did not simplify the moment. It only made it more real, more immediate, and Ethan nodded once, the movement slow, deliberate, as if he was accepting something that had already been decided without him. He glanced at Amara again, the resemblance no longer something he was analyzing, but something he was recognizing, and when he spoke next, the words were no longer constructed, they were direct, unfiltered in a way that did not come naturally to him. Does she know? And this time the question did not leave space for interpretation, and Lena's breath caught just slightly, the smallest pause, but enough to show that this was the question she had expected, the one she had prepared for, the one she had hoped would not come in a room like this. She looked down at Amara, her hand still resting gently on her shoulder, and then back at Ethan, her expression steadying again. She knows what she needs to know, she said, not offering more, not explaining, but defining the limit clearly, and Ethan felt it, that line, that boundary, and for a moment, he did not push against it, he did not move forward, because something in the way she said it made him understand that whatever came next would not be decided by him alone. And in that realization, something shifted again, not outwardly, not in a way anyone else could point to, but internally, a recognition that this was no longer about what he could control, but about what he had already left behind, and whether he was willing to face it now that it had stepped directly into his path. The room did not change, the same quiet hum of climate control, the same skyline beyond the glass, the same polished desk separating order from everything that did not belong to it. And yet the space felt different now, as if something unseen had shifted its weight, pressing gently but persistently against Ethan Cole's sense of certainty, and he stood there, not moving, not speaking, because for the first time in a long while, there was no immediate action that felt correct, no clear directive that would resolve what was unfolding in front of him. Lena's words still lingered. She knows what she needs to know, and the restraint in that sentence held more meaning than any explanation she could have offered. It was not avoidance. It was choice, and that choice did not belong to him. He exhaled slowly, his gaze lowering for a moment before lifting again, this time not toward Lena, but toward Amara, who had not moved, who had not withdrawn from the moment even as the tension around her deepened, and there was something in that stillness that made it impossible to continue treating this as a situation to manage. Amara, he said, her name spoken with a steadiness that carried less authority and more intention, and the girl responded immediately, her attention already on him, as if she had been waiting for him to speak again. Yes, she said softly, and the simplicity of her response left no space for distance. Ethan took a small step closer, not enough to close the space entirely, but enough that the conversation no longer felt formal, and when he spoke again, his voice had shifted, quieter, more careful. Do you understand what we are talking about? He asked, not because he expected a complete answer, but because he needed to know what she believed this moment meant. Amara considered the question, her eyes steady, her expression thoughtful in a way that did not belong to someone her age. And then she nodded once. You are asking if you are my dad, she said, not uncertain, not hesitant, just stating what she understood, and the directness of it removed the last layer of distance Ethan had been holding on to. Lena's hand tightened again on her shoulder, not pulling her back, but anchoring her, and her voice followed, low but firm. Amara. But the girl did not stop, because in her mind, the conversation had already reached its point. It is okay, she added quietly, glancing up at her mother before returning her gaze to Ethan. I already know what I feel. And that sentence did not answer his question in the way he expected. It did not confirm or deny. It did not provide the clarity he had built his life around. But it carried something else, something that did not require proof to exist. Ethan felt the weight of that, the difference between what could be verified and what was simply known. And for a moment, he did not respond. Because the usual tools he relied on did not apply here. There was no contract to review, no data to validate. Only a presence he could not ignore. Lena stepped forward slightly now, her posture no longer just guarded, but resolved. Sir, she said, her voice controlled but carrying a quiet strength. Whatever you think this is, it does not change anything that has already happened. And the words were not defensive. They were final, drawing a line not out of fear, but out of clarity, and Ethan looked at her, really looked this time, seeing not just the employee, not just the past, but the years in between, the decisions she had made without him, the life she had built without waiting for him to return. He nodded once, slowly, the movement acknowledging something he had not yet put into words, and then he spoke again, his tone no longer trying to maintain distance. It might not change the past, he said, but it changes what I do next. And that was the first statement in the room that moved forward instead of backward, the first one that acknowledged not just what had been, but what could still be decided. Lena's expression shifted, not dramatically, but enough to show that she had heard the difference, that she recognized the shift in direction, and for a moment, she did not respond, because whatever came next was no longer something she could fully predict either. Amara looked between them again, her small frame still, her presence steady, and then she took a step forward, closing the space just a little more, her voice soft but clear. Then what are you going to do? She asked, and the question, simple as it was, carried more weight than anything else that had been said, because it did not ask for explanation, it asked for action, and Ethan Cole, who had built his life on always having an answer, stood there for a brief moment longer than usual, realizing that this time, the answer he gave would not just define a decision, it would define who he chose to be. The question did not leave the room. It settled into it, steady and unavoidable, and Ethan Cole felt it land in a place that had not been touched by decision or strategy in years, because this was not a negotiation, not a calculated move. It was something else entirely, something that required more than logic, and he stood there for a moment longer than usual, his gaze fixed on Amara, who had asked it without hesitation, without fear, as if the answer belonged to her just as much as it belonged to him. He drew a slow breath, the kind that did not reset control, but acknowledged its absence, and when he spoke, his voice was different, not louder, not firmer, but more honest than anything he had said since they entered the room. "I do not know yet," he said, and the admission hung in the air, unexpected, not because the words themselves were complicated, but because they came from a man who was never uncertain in front of others. And yet he did not look away, did not soften it, he let it stand exactly as it was. Lena's eyes shifted slightly, studying him in a way she had not before, not searching for authority, but for sincerity. And there was a brief moment where something in her expression loosened, not trust, not fully, but recognition of the fact that he was no longer speaking from the distance she had expected. Amara nodded slowly, as if the answer made sense to her, as if uncertainty was not something she needed to fear. And then she asked again, her voice softer this time, but no less direct. "Then can you try?" And the simplicity of it cut through everything else, reducing the complexity of the situation into something that did not require a perfect answer, only a willing one. Ethan felt that shift again, deeper this time, because trying was not a strategy, it was a choice, one that did not guarantee control or outcome, and he had spent years avoiding exactly that kind of uncertainty. But standing here, with Lena watching, with Amara waiting, the alternative felt heavier than the risk itself. He nodded once. Slowly, the movement deliberate. "Yes," he said, and the word was small, but it carried more weight than any agreement he had ever signed, because it did not come with conditions, it did not outline terms, it simply existed as a decision to move forward without knowing exactly where it would lead. Lena exhaled quietly, the sound barely audible, but it marked a shift in her posture, the tension in her shoulders easing just slightly, not because everything was resolved, but because something had changed direction, and she stepped forward just enough to stand beside Amara rather than behind her, no longer shielding, but present, equal in the space. "Trying does not change what has been," she said, her voice steady, not dismissing his answer, but grounding it, and Ethan met her gaze, understanding the meaning beneath it, that this was not about rewriting the past. It was about whether he was willing to face it without retreating. "I know," he replied, and for once, the words did not feel like a conclusion, they felt like a beginning. The room settled into a different kind of silence now, not tense, not uncertain, but quiet in a way that allowed space for something new to exist, and Amara took another small step forward, closing the gap just a little more, her hand lifting slightly as if she was about to reach out, then pausing, giving him the chance to respond, not with words, but with presence. Ethan noticed it, the hesitation, the openness, and for a brief moment, he considered it, not as a calculation, but as a choice, and then he moved, not quickly, not dramatically, but enough, his hand extending just slightly, not touching yet, but meeting her halfway, acknowledging that this moment did not belong to him alone. Lena watched carefully, her eyes following the movement, not intervening, not stopping it, but not stepping away either, holding her place in the moment as it unfolded, and the distance between them, all three of them, shifted again, not erased, but reduced, made smaller by something that could not be defined by position or title. Outside the office, the city continued as it always did, unaware, unchanged, but inside that room, something had begun to realign, not perfectly, not completely, but enough to alter the direction of what came next. And Ethan Cole, who had built his life on certainty, stood there, with his hand extended toward a future he had not planned, understanding for the first time that not knowing did not mean he was unprepared. It meant he was finally willing to see what he had once chosen to ignore. Her hand did not rush forward. It waited, small and steady in the space between them, as if it understood something that neither adult had fully accepted yet, and Ethan Cole saw it. Not just the gesture, but the patience inside it, the quiet permission it offered without demanding anything in return, and for a moment, the room held that stillness again, not tense this time, but suspended in something softer, something that did not belong to contracts or decisions, but to presence. His hand moved the rest of the way, closing the gap with a gentleness that felt unfamiliar to him, his fingers lightly meeting hers, not gripping, not claiming, just touching, and the contact was brief, simple, but it carried a weight that settled deeper than anything else that had been said, because it was not about certainty, it was about acknowledgement, Amara's fingers curled slightly around his. Her expression unchanged, not surprised, not emotional, just calm, as if this was exactly what she had expected from the beginning. And she looked up at him with that same steady gaze. "See," she said quietly, not as proof, not as argument, but as something that did not need explanation. And Ethan felt something shift again, not in a way he could define, but in a way he could not ignore. Lena watched closely, her posture still guarded, but no longer defensive, her eyes moving between them, measuring not the action itself, but the intention behind it. And for the first time, there was no immediate tension in her shoulders, only a careful awareness, as if she was allowing the moment to exist without deciding what it meant yet. Ethan slowly withdrew his hand, not pulling away, just letting the contact end naturally. And he looked at Amara for a second longer before his gaze lifted to Lena, the question still there, but no longer urgent, no longer something he needed answered immediately, because something else had taken its place, something quieter, but more grounded. "I was not there," he said, the words coming without preparation, without structure, and that alone made them different from anything else he had said. "I did not know." And it was not an excuse, not a defense, just a statement, simple and direct. And Lena's eyes held his, absorbing the words without reacting right away, because she had heard similar things before in different forms, from different people. But this time, the tone was not dismissive, it was not distant, it was present. "You chose not to know," she replied, her voice calm, not sharp, but clear, and the distinction mattered, not to accuse, but to define. And Ethan did not argue, did not correct her, because he recognized the truth in that difference. The way he had stepped away when the situation no longer aligned with the life he wanted to maintain. He nodded once, slowly. "Yes," he said, and that agreement did not resolve anything, but it removed the space for denial. And in that, something settled between them, not forgiveness, not yet, but clarity. Amara looked between them again, her small presence anchoring the moment in a way neither adult could replicate. And then she spoke, her voice soft but certain. "You are here now," and the simplicity of it shifted the focus forward again, away from what had been missed, toward what was still possible. And Ethan felt that shift, felt the weight of it, because being here now was not the same as being there before, but it was not nothing either. Lena exhaled quietly, the sound carrying a mix of restraint and release, and she looked down at Amara for a moment before lifting her gaze again. "Being here is not enough," she said, her tone steady, not rejecting, but grounding the moment once more. And Ethan understood that too, understood that presence without consistency meant little, that words without action would not hold. And for the first time, he did not try to counter it, did not offer a solution immediately. He simply accepted it as part of what came next. "Then I will learn what enough means," he said. And the statement was not polished, not precise, but it was real. And Lena studied him again, longer this time, as if she was measuring not the words, but the possibility behind them. And she did not respond right away, because the answer to that would not be decided in a single moment. The room grew quiet again, but it was no longer the same silence from before. It was softer now, less rigid, holding space instead of tension. And Amara stepped slightly closer, not reaching this time, just standing, her presence steady between them. And outside the glass walls of the office, the city continued its movement, unaware of the shift that had taken place inside, a shift that was not loud, not dramatic, but real. And as Ethan Cole stood there, no longer just the owner of the building, but a man facing something he had once left behind, he understood that this was not an ending, not even a resolution. It was the beginning of something he could not control. But for the first time, he did not try to control it, he simply stayed. The room did not rush to close the moment. It held it, quietly, like something that understood the weight of what had just shifted and refused to interrupt it with anything unnecessary. And Ethan Cole stood there without moving, not because he did not know what to do, but because for the first time, doing nothing felt like the right choice, like staying present mattered more than controlling the outcome. Lena remained where she was, her hand resting lightly on Amara's shoulder, not guiding, not pulling, just there. And her posture no longer carried the same guarded tension it had when she first stepped into the office. It was steadier now, grounded in something that did not depend on his reaction, something she had built long before this moment. Amara looked up at him again, her expression unchanged, still calm, still certain in a way that did not ask for proof. And then she smiled, not wide, not bright, just enough to soften the space between them. And it was that small shift, that quiet warmth, that altered everything more than any words could have. Ethan noticed it immediately, the way the room felt. Different because of something so simple, and for a moment, he allowed himself to stay in that feeling without analyzing it, without trying to define it, just recognizing it as something real. "We should go," Lena said gently after a while, her voice calm, not rushing the moment, but acknowledging that life outside this room still existed, still needed to continue. And Ethan nodded slowly, the motion natural now, not delayed, not uncertain. "Yes," he said, and this time the word did not carry hesitation. It carried acceptance, not of an ending, but of a continuation. Amara stepped back toward her mother, her hand finding Lena's again, the connection effortless, familiar, and as they turned slightly toward the door, Ethan spoke once more, not to stop them, but to mark something that mattered. "Lena," he said, and she paused, looking back at him, her expression open but measured, and he held her gaze, not as an employer, not as someone above her, but as someone standing on equal ground for the first time in years. "I will not disappear again," he said, the words simple, not elaborate, not promised with conditions, just stated, and Lena studied him for a moment, longer than before, as if she was weighing not the words, but the man who spoke them, and then she nodded once, not agreement, not forgiveness, but acknowledgement, a recognition that this time, he had said something different. Amara looked between them, sensing the shift even if she did not fully understand it. And then she squeezed her mother's hand lightly before looking back at Ethan, her voice soft but clear. "Bye," she said, not with finality, but with the quiet assumption that this was not the last time, and that assumption carried more certainty than anything else in the room. Ethan inclined his head slightly, a gesture small but genuine. "Goodbye, Amara," he replied, and the way he said her name no longer felt unfamiliar. It felt grounded, connected to something that now existed beyond a file or a question. They moved toward the door together, the faint sound of the cart wheels returning as they reached for the handle, and when the door opened, the soft hum of the hallway filtered back in, the world outside continuing as it always had, unchanged, unaware, and yet as Lena and Amara stepped out, something had undeniably shifted inside the room. They left behind. The door closed quietly, sealing the space once more, but the silence that followed was no longer empty. It was filled with something that remained, something that did not leave when they did, and Ethan stood there for a moment longer, his reflection faint in the glass, the city stretching out beyond him as it always had. But his focus was no longer on the skyline. It was on the space that had just been occupied, the presence that had altered the direction of everything he thought he understood. He turned slowly, walking back toward his desk, the photograph still resting where he had left it, and he picked it up one last time, looking at it differently now, not as something from the past, but as part of something still unfolding. And as he set it down again, his movement steady, his posture unchanged, there was one thing that no longer aligned with the man who had stood in this office that morning. Because this time, when Ethan Cole looked at his reflection, he did not just see the owner of a hotel, he saw someone who had finally chosen to stay.